Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Paris in the 18th century. Today, we think of Paris as the city of lights, of romance, of perfume and charm. But back then it was nothing like that. The very first thing you would notice would not be the sight of elegant buildings or fashionable people, but the overwhelming stench in the air. A heavy, suffocating odor would wrap around you, so strong that a modern visitor would probably turn back instantly. But for the people of that time, this was simply life. They had grown used to breathing in what we would call unbearable. The population of Paris was growing rapidly. Cafes were alive with debate. Philosophers were talking about reason and enlightenment. Artists were creating masterpieces. But just outside their doors, the streets were filled with filth. Garbage piled up along alleys. Animal waste mixed with the mud, and human waste flowed openly through shallow gutters. Horses were everywhere, pulling carriages through the crowded streets, leaving behind tons of manure each day. Rain didn't wash it away. Instead, it spread the smell further, mixing with stagnant water and forming a permanent stench that clung to every corner of the city. To the people living there, smell was a constant companion. It came from everywhere. The tanneries working with animal hides, the butchers who left scraps of blood and flesh outside their shops, the fishmongers selling half-rotting fish by the river, even the Seine itself. That beautiful river we picture today, lined with tourists and bridges, was in the 1700s. A giant sewer. All kinds of waste, from chamber pots to factory runoff, ended up in the water, and the smell rose from it like a ghost that followed the wind. Inside the homes, things weren't much better. Most houses didn't have proper sanitation. People used chamber pots, and when they were full, the contents were often emptied right out the window into the street. Imagine walking below and suddenly hearing someone shout a quick warning before tossing waste into the gutter. This was a daily reality. Wooden buildings absorbed the odors, so even indoors there was no true escape. The smell of smoke from fireplaces mixed with sweat, food gone bad, and mold from damp walls. Perfume, which Paris would later become famous for, was not originally about luxury or seduction. It was survival. Rich people drenched themselves in heavy scents, not because they wanted to smell beautiful, but because they wanted to cover up the reek of everything around them, including their own bodies. Bathing was rare, partly because water was seen as dangerous and spreading disease. So people masked odors with musk, flowers, and oils, layering them over the constant background stench of the city. Walking down a busy street in 18th century Paris was like passing through waves of different smells. You might first catch the sharp sting of urine from a corner alley, then the greasy smoke of street food frying, followed by the metallic temps of blood dripping from a butcher's stand. Then, as you turned into a residential lane, the smell of wastewater mixing with mud hit your nose. And yet, for those Parisians, this was normal. They complained about it, they joked about it, but they also tolerated it, because there was no alternative. This smell didn't just make the city unpleasant, it was a constant reminder of health risks. Epidemics were common, and although people didn't fully understand germs yet, they believed strongly that foul air, or miasma, caused disease. The horrible odor of Paris was seen as a dangerous force in itself, spreading sickness through the air. Whenever plague or fever struck, authorities tried to control the smell by burning incense, cleaning a few streets, or ordering lime to be sprinkled over waste. But these efforts were like throwing a bucket of water into a firestorm. Still, life went on. People fell in love, raised families, and created art while living in what would now seem like intolerable conditions. The contrast is striking. The same city that gave birth to ideas of liberty and reason was choking under clouds of stench. It is almost impossible for us today, surrounded by modern sanitation and clean water systems, to imagine what it would be like to never know fresh air, to never escape the background odor of rotten waste. But that was Paris in the 18th century, brilliant, alive, and absolutely horrifying to the nose. By the middle of the 1700s, Paris had become one of the largest cities in Europe. Its population was swelling past 500,000, and the city was struggling under the weight of its own growth. More people meant more waste, more animals, more markets, and more smoke. Paris was alive with energy, but the price of that energy was a thick, suffocating atmosphere that no one could ever escape. Markets were especially notorious. The most famous was Les Halles, the belly of Paris, where food of all kinds poured in from the countryside. On the surface, it was a place of abundance, overflowing with fruits, vegetables, bread, cheese, meat, and fish. But in reality, it was also overflowing with refuse. The smell of ripe produce blended with the smell of rot, because not everything sold before it spoiled. The air was filled with the buzzing of flies, attracted to carcasses hanging in the open. Slaughterhouses were nearby, their floors sticky with blood, their drains clogged with fat and offal. Walking through the market, one might gag at the overwhelming mixture. The sweetness of ripe melons, the sourness of spoiled milk, the iron temps of blood, and the ever-present smell of waste soaking the ground beneath your feet. The city authorities tried, from time to time, to regulate these spaces. They issued rules about when waste had to be removed, or how butchers should dispose of animal parts. But enforcement was weak. Corruption, lack of manpower, and the sheer volume of refuse made any real solution impossible. As a result, the streets near markets were some of the foulest in all of Paris, and they became breeding grounds for disease. The river Seine, which cut through the city like a lifeline, was also its greatest curse. By the 18th century, the Seine was already infamous for its smell. It carried away not only the household waste of hundreds of thousands of people, but also the industrial waste of tanners, dyers, and other workshops. Skins soaked in chemicals were dumped directly into the water. Dyers poured out vats of colored liquids, staining the current, and chamber pots, emptied into gutters, eventually led to the river. Standing on one of the bridges, instead of being greeted by a refreshing breeze, you would be met by a wave of noxious air rising from the brown, sluggish water below. It was said that fish could hardly survive in some parts of the Seine, and yet people still drew drinking water from it, filling buckets with liquid that carried disease straight into their homes. The poor, of course, suffered the most. Wealthy Parisians could retreat into larger houses, with servants to manage waste, perfumes to cover odors, and more access to fresh water from private wells. But the majority lived in cramped tenements where dozens of families shared a single latrine if one existed at all. In many neighborhoods, human waste was simply collected in pits beneath buildings, seeping into the soil and releasing a constant, sour stench. When these cesspits overflowed, as they often did, the filth had to be emptied by workers, called vidangers, who carried the waste through the streets in carts at night. Even this cleaning filled the city with unbearable odors, as barrels of human excrement sloshed through narrow alleys. It is important to remember that the sense of smell was different for people then. Modern noses used to deodorants, sewage systems, and fresh water would find 18th century Paris unbearable. But Parisians themselves had grown up with these conditions. They still complained about the smell, but they had adapted. Smells were not only tolerated, they were often seen as useful. Doctors believed that certain strong odors could protect people from disease. Vinegar, smoke, and strong perfumes were thought to cleanse the air, and people carried handkerchiefs soaked in scented oils to press against their noses. Instead of eliminating bad smells, people tried to fight them with stronger ones. There was also a strange hierarchy of odors. Some smells were considered dangerous, like the rotting stench of corpses or the sour air of swamps, which were linked to fever. But others, like the smell of manure, were seen as normal, even healthy, because they were part of agricultural life. The line between foul and acceptable smells was blurry, and people lived in a cloud of them every day. Nighttime in Paris had its own distinct odor. As darkness fell and lanterns lit the streets, the air grew heavy with smoke from candles and fireplaces. The stench of waste dumped during the day still lingered, but now it mixed with the smells of cooking from taverns, sweat from crowded inns, and the dampness of the river. Rats scurried through alleys, drawn by scraps and refuse. For a traveler arriving at night, the smell would have been the first and strongest impression of the city. And yet, through all this, Paris was admired across Europe as a center of culture, art, and fashion. Visitors often wrote about the elegance of French society, the brilliance of its philosophers, and the beauty of its architecture. But buried in their travel diaries were also constant remarks about the stench. English travelers, in particular, mocked the filth of Paris compared to London, though London itself was hardly a fragrant paradise. Smell was a fact of life in European cities, but Paris, with its size and density, had earned a special reputation. The paradox of 18th century Paris was that its people were both horrified by the smells and strangely resigned to them. The city reeked, yet it thrived. Philosophers wrote about liberty and human rights while walking past overflowing aristocrats in powdered wigs discussed art while dabbing perfume under their noses to block out the reek. The smell of Paris was not just a background detail, it was a central part of daily life, woven into the very fabric of the city. As the 18th century wore on, the problem of smell in Paris was not only a nuisance, but also a subject of genuine fear. The medical theories of the time linked disease directly to odor. This belief, called the miasma theory, held that bad air carried sickness. If you inhaled the foul vapors rising from the streets or the river, you risked catching fever, plague, or worse. The citizens of Paris lived with a constant anxiety that the smells around them were not only disgusting but deadly. Imagine a hot summer day in Paris, when the heat pressed down on the city and magnified every odor. The contents of cesspits bubbled in the warmth, sending waves of stench up through the narrow alleys. The river baked under the sun, releasing the concentrated smell of rot. Butchers left entrails outside, where they attracted clouds of flies. People covered their faces with scarves, soaked in vinegar, hoping the sharp scent would shield them from disease. Perfume sellers did good business, not because people wanted to smell pleasant, but because they wanted to protect themselves. Strong scents lavender, rose water, camphor, believed to push back the deadly air. The strange irony is that while people feared these smells, they also created them in staggering amounts. In a city without proper sewage or trash collection, the cycle was endless. Chamber pots filled up daily, and their contents were dumped into gutters or carts. Horses pulling carriages through the streets left piles of manure behind. Dead animals were sometimes left to rot where they fell, and industries such as tanning leather filled neighborhoods with chemical fumes. Even the fashion of the time contributed to the odor. Wigs and clothing required powders and oils that grew rancid in the summer heat, clinging to the bodies of those who wore them. For the poor, there was little escape. Tenement houses were crammed with little ventilation, and the stench of bodies mingled with cooking smoke and sewage seeping from below. For the wealthy, escape meant withdrawing behind heavy curtains, burning scented candles, and spraying perfume. Aristocrats prided themselves on elegant scents, while ordinary Parisians struggled to breathe through the putrid air outside their doors. This divide between classes could even be smelled. The rich reeked of perfume, while the poor reeked of sweat and survival. Animals played a central role in the city's smellscape. Horses were everywhere, pulling carts, carriages, and wagons. Each left behind a steady stream of droppings, which accumulated in piles along the streets. Dogs roamed freely, leaving their own tracers. Cats were tolerated because they hunted rats, but they too added to the city's odor. And in markets, the smell of livestock chickens, pigs, goats mixed with that of slaughtered animals. The city was alive with animals, but their presence was written in scent as much as sight or sound. Even religious life had its smells. Churches, with their incense and candles, offered a reprieve from the stench of the streets, but they were not immune. Crowds of worshippers brought in the smells of sweat and unwashed clothes. Cemeteries, especially those located in the heart of the city, were infamous. The Cemetery of the Innocents was the worst of all, where bodies were piled high in shallow graves, and the smell of decay spread 4 blocks. Residents living nearby complained of the unbearable stench, and stories spread of bones and corpses surfacing after heavy rains. To live near a cemetery was to live in the shadow of death, both seen and smelled. Despite all of this, people managed to live their lives. They fell in love. They gathered in cafes. They strolled through gardens. Their noses had adapted to the constant barrage of odors, to the point where only the strongest shocks were noticed. Travelers, however, were often overwhelmed. Visitors wrote home about the filth of Paris, warning others to be prepared for someone stepping into the city for the first time. It was as if every alley and every square shouted its presence through the nose. It is easy, from our modern perspective, to think of 18th century Parisians as dirty or careless. But the truth is that they were products of their time. Sanitation as we know it did not exist. Germ theory had not yet been discovered. Smells were the closest thing to a warning system they had, and so they lived in a constant dialogue with their noses. A whiff of something rotten could mean danger, while the smell of flowers or incense was a comfort. In T's world, scent shaped how people understood health, morality, and even social class. The stench of Paris was more than just unpleasant. It was a force that shaped the daily rhythm of life. Bakers rose early to prepare bread, and by mid-morning, the smell of fresh loaves mingled with the refuse outside their shops. By noon, the heat and activity of the day raised the city's stench to a peak, and by evening, taverns released the odors of spilled beer, roasted meat, and drunken butt. Night was quieter, but the smells never disappeared. They only lingered, waiting for the sun to rise again and stir them back into motion. Paris, in the 18th century, was a place of contradiction. It was the center of Enlightenment thought, the home of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot, where new ideas about reason, liberty, and science were being debated. Yet outside the salons and libraries, the streets reeked of centuries-old problems. Progress in thought did not mean progress in sanitation. The city was both a beacon of modernity and a swamp of medieval smells. To walk its streets was to experience both at once. Brilliance and filth, elegance and decay, perfume and rot. By the mid-18th century, Paris had earned a paradoxical reputation. It was the center of enlightenment, fashion, philosophy, and art. But it was also known for its unbearable stench. Foreign visitors often recorded their astonishment in letters and diaries, describing the city as dazzling yet revolting. Writers compared the smell of Paris to a mixture of rotting meat, stagnant water, and human waste. The irony was striking. A city that shaped ideas of beauty and refinement was at the same time drowning in its own filth. One major contributor to this infamous odor was the Seine River. Today admire it for its beauty. In the 1700s, the Seine was effectively an open soup. People dumped chamber pots, animal remains, and household waste directly into the water. Tanneries, butchers, and dye houses along the riverbanks poured their industrial byproducts into the current, staining the water a greasy brown. On hot summer days, the smell of decomposing matter rose from the river like a poisonous mist, seeping into every street. The bridges across the Seine, which were often lined with houses, had no drainage systems. Waste simply dropped from the windows into the water below, adding to the foul brew. But the Seine was only one part of the problem. Within the city walls, narrow, winding streets trapped smells and waste like a sealed jar. Paris was densely populated, and most homes lacked private toilets. Instead, residents relied on chamber pots, which were either emptied onto the streets or carried to many cesspits were poorly constructed, overflowing into neighboring cellars or seeping through the soil into wells, contaminating drinking water. In some cases, cesspits had no covers at all, leaving the air heavy with the pungent smell of ammonia and decay. Visitors often remarked that one could not walk more than a few steps without encountering either a foul puddle or a nauseating stench. The meat trade made matters even worse. The markets of Les Halles, known as the Belly of Paris, sold vast quantities of meat every day. Butchering was done on site, and the remains of slaughtered animals' blood, bones, skin, and entrails were dumped in the streets or thrown into the river. Dogs, rats, and scavenger birds feasted on the remains, while the smell of drying blood clung to the air. In summer, the heat turned the markets into open charnel houses, while in winter, the odor mixed with the smoke of thousands of wood fires, producing a choking haze. Even the perfumes that Paris was famous for carried an ironic connection to the city's stench. Perfume was not originally designed as a luxury, it was a necessity. Wealthy Parisians and aristocrats drenched themselves in scented oils and powders to mask the foul smells that lingered in their homes and streets. The very popularity of perfume in 18th century, Paris was a direct response to the city's inability to control waste and sanitation. In this way, the luxurious scent of roses and jasmine was always battling the pervasive background odor of rot and filth. The authorities were not blind to the problem. Complaints about the smell of Paris reached the city's administrators constantly, especially from foreign diplomats and aristocrats. Some efforts were made to clean the streets, such as hiring workers to collect waste or covering However, the sheer volume of filth overwhelmed any organized attempt at sanitation. For the poor who lived in crowded tenements, bad smells were part of daily survival. For the rich, unpleasant odors were an inconvenience. They could escape by retreating to country estates. The smell of Paris also carried symbolic weight. Philosophers and social critics of the time often drew connections between the city's physical filth and its moral corruption. The stench became a metaphor for the decay of society itself. Writers like Voltaire and Rousseau commented not only on the smell of the streets, but also on what it revealed about inequality, government neglect, and the failure to modernize. In the Rise. The horrifying odor of Paris was both a literal and figurative sign that something was rotten at the heart of French society. And yet, despite all of this, Paris continued to flourish as a cultural capital. Painters, writers, and intellectuals thrived in the same environment that disgusted visitors with its unbearable odors. It was this striking contradiction between beauty and filth, elegance and decay that gave the city its strange identity. Paris was a place of brilliance, but beneath the glitter of salons and theaters, it was drowning in the smell of its own waste. As the 18th century progressed, the stench of Paris became more than a matter of discomfort. It was a public health crisis. Though people of the time did not fully understand germs or bacteria, they believed in the theory of miasma, the idea that foul smells themselves carried disease. To breathe in the air of a Paris street was thought to invite fevers, cholera, or plague. Whether or not the odor directly caused illness, there was truth in the connection. The waste that produced the city's stench also contaminated food, water, and living spaces, creating perfect conditions for outbreaks. In neighborhoods like the Latin Quarter or the Marais, poverty and overcrowding made the problem even worse. Tenements housed multiple families in small, damp rooms, with no running water or sewage system. Waste piled up in shared courtyards or spilled into the streets. Rain would wash some of it away, but much of it simply stagnated in the gutters. During hot summers, the streets buzzed with flies, while during winters, the freezing air locked the odors into a suffocating stillness. People grew accustomed to the smells, but visitors often wrote of gagging at every step. Public officials tried to implement rules, such as restricting the hours when chamber pots could be emptied into the streets. Yet enforcement was weak, and most Parisians ignored such laws. The night watchman, tasked with ensuring cleanliness, often turned a blind eye or accepted bribes. As a result, the practice of simply flinging waste from windows remained common, even in wealthy districts. Cri sauvegarde. Elle. A warning that waste was about to be dumped echoed through the streets at night. Anyone unlucky enough to pass below risked being splashed by a bucket of urine or worse. But it wasn't just human waste that choked the city. Tanneries, dye workshops, and slaughterhouses added industrial smells that were even more overwhelming. Leather tanning required soaking animal hides in vats of urine and lime, producing a sour, acrid stench that could be smelled for blocks. Dyers used chemicals like alum and copper sulfate, which left behind sharp metallic odors. Soap makers boiled animal fat in large cauldrons, filling the air with greasy smoke. The districts near these trades were often described as uninhabitable, yet poor workers had no choice but to live beside the very industries that poisoned their air. Water sources were equally contaminated. Wells often sat near cesspits, allowing sewage to seep into drinking supplies. Wealthier households tried to avoid this by purchasing water delivered in barrels from upstream, but the poor had no such luxury. They drank what was available, often water tainted with fecal matter or industrial waste. Diarrheal diseases, typhoid, and dysentery were rampant, further adding to the city's reputation for filth. Despite these conditions, Paris remained a magnet for ambitious people. Students, merchants, and artisans flocked to the city, drawn by its promise of opportunity. Writers and artists painted a glamorous picture of Paris as the center of European culture. But behind the salons and coffeehouses lay a darker reality. The same streets where philosophers debated liberty and equality reeked of rotting offal and overflowing The Enlightenment's grand ideas of progress were being born in a city that had yet to solve the most basic challenge of sanitation. Foreigners found this contradiction shocking. English travelers, in particular, often mocked Paris for its filth, boasting of London's comparatively cleaner streets though London had plenty of sanitation problems of its own. German visitors remarked that the air of Paris seemed to cling to one's clothes, carrying odors long after they had left the city. Yet, strangely, many of these same travelers also admitted that they quickly grew used to the smells after a few weeks. As though Paris had a way of dulling the senses, the smells of Paris also carried a social dimension. For the wealthy, the ability to escape the city as stench by retreating to country estates or masking it with expensive perfumes was a symbol of privilege. Perfumed wigs, powdered clothing, and sachets of dried flowers were more than fashion accessories. They were shields against the foulness of urban life. Meanwhile, the poor had no such protection, their bodies and homes carrying the same odors as the streets outside. In this sense, the smell of Paris reinforced class divisions, marking those who could afford escape and those who could not. By the late 1700s, the problem had become so notorious that satirical pamphlets and plays began to mock the city as stench. Some joked that Paris could be identified miles away by its odor alone. Others suggested that the smell of Paris was part of its identity, as inseparable as its cafes, cathedrals, and cobblestones. For Parisians themselves, the horror of the city's odor was both a burden and, strangely, a point of resilience. They had learned to live, work, and even thrive in an environment that outsiders found unlivable. Still, the growing awareness of sanitation problems hinted at the changes to come. Doctors and reformers began calling for improvements, linking foul smells to disease with increasing urgency. Though their scientific understanding was incomplete, their instincts were correct. Without addressing the city's waste, Paris would remain a place where brilliance and decay walked side by side. As the 18th century moved into its later decades, Paris began to face the consequences of its stench, not only in matters of health, but also in matters of reputation. Travelers' accounts circulated widely, and the descriptions were far from flattering. Paris was the cultural capital of Europe, home to philosophers, salons, and theaters. Yet, foreigners increasingly associated it with filth. For a city so proud of its elegance and refinement, this was a dangerous contradiction. The Parisian authorities could not ignore the complaints forever. The monarchy, desperate to maintain Paris's grandeur, occasionally launched attempts at cleaning. Orders were given to sweep the streets, dredge cesspools, or regulate the butchers and tanners, but such measures were inconsistent and rarely effective. The deeper issue lay in infrastructure. Unlike Rome, which centuries earlier had built aqueducts and sewers, Paris had expanded without planning. Narrow medieval streets twisted through neighborhoods that had no drainage systems, no fresh water supply, and no proper disposal sites for waste. The city's very layout trapped the filth inside it. Despite these challenges, Parisians developed a strange relationship with the smells that surrounded them. Some historians argued that they became nose-blind, so accustomed to the odors that they barely noticed them, unless they were especially intense. Others described the way Parisians identified districts by their scents. Fish markets, tanneries, bakeries, and cesspools all produced distinct olfactory landmarks. Smell, in this sense, became part of navigating the city. A street might not be remembered for its architecture, but rather for the odor of rotting hides or spilled wine that lingered there. Yet for those who studied medicine or the environment, the stench was not so easy to dismiss. Doctors began warning that the air of Paris was corrupted. Without a clear understanding of microbes, they blamed bad smells for spreading disease through invisible particles. The concept of miasma, literally, polluted air, was widely accepted. If a neighborhood smelled foul, it was thought to be dangerous, and people avoided it. When epidemics broke out, authorities rushed to burn incense, light fires in the streets, or spray vinegar, believing that strong odors could combat deadly ones. But these remedies were little more than rituals. In reality, the poor bore the brunt of the consequences. Their homes stood closest to cesspits, slaughterhouses, and polluted wells. When disease swept through Paris, it struck hardest in these overcrowded districts. Meanwhile, the rich retreated to airy boulevards, perfume-filled salons, and countryside estates, shielding themselves as best they could. The city's smell thus mirrored its inequality. To be poor in Paris was to live in an environment where the very air you breathed felt like an enemy. The contradiction grew sharper as Paris rose as the beacon of Enlightenment thought. Philosophers wrote of progress, science, and reason, yet outside their salons, horses defecated freely on the streets, and chamber pots splashed their contents onto passers. Imagine a heated debate on liberty and equality taking place while just beyond the window, a man shoveled rotting refuse into the gutter. For those who witnessed both sides, Paris appeared as a city of brilliance and decay in equal measure. Art and literature of the time sometimes reflected this reality. Writers described the stench as overwhelming, a force of nature that shaped daily life. The smell of Paris was more than a background detail, it was a character in its own right, always present, unavoidable, and influential. Satirical pamphlets mocked the monarchy for ignoring the city's filth, suggesting that even the royal perfumes of Versailles could not cover up the stench drifting in from Paris. Some even joked that foreign enemies did not need to invade France. They could simply wait for the city to poison itself with its own foul air. And yet, for all its horrors, Paris never lost its magnetism. The very same decades that saw the city at its smelliest were also the decades when its culture shone brightest. Coffee houses bustled with debate. Theaters premiered bold new works, and artists experimented with revolutionary styles. Foreigners came despite the odors, enduring the stench for a chance to witness the brilliance. In some strange way, the foul air seemed inseparable from the vitality of the city. Paris was dirty, yes, but it was also alive, pulsing with energy, ideas, and ambition. By the 1780s, however, the stench had taken on a more symbolic weight. For many, the foul air represented the corruption of the old order. Just as the monarchy failed to clean its streets, it failed to address the deeper injustices of society. The stink of Paris was seen as a metaphor for political rot, a sign that the system itself was decaying. Revolutionaries would later use this imagery, describing the Ancien regime as something that needed to be purged, cleansed, or destroyed. In this way, the physical stench of 18th century Paris became tied to the ideological winds of revolution. What outsiders found horrifying, Parisians increasingly saw as intolerable. Complaints grew louder, not only from foreign travelers, but also from within the city itself. Ordinary citizens began demanding change. The stench was no longer just an inconvenience. It had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with Paris, and by extension, France itself. This tension between the brilliance of Enlightenment Paris and the filth of its streets set the stage for one of the greatest upheavals in history. The smell of rot, waste, and decay hung in the air, not only literally, but metaphorically, as the old world teetered on the brink of collapse. The horrifying smell of Paris in the 18th century was more than a sensory detail, it was a sign of an empire at its breaking point. By the closing years of the 18th century, Paris was not only the stage for intellectual revolutions, but also the physical embodiment of everything that was decaying in French society. The horrifying smell that clung to its narrow streets was no longer just an irritation, it was a warning. A constant reminder that the city's foundations, both literal and political, were when the French Revolution erupted in 1789, many Parisians looked at their city through new eyes. The filth and odor of Paris were seen as part of the oppression they had endured under the Ancien regime. If the monarchy had ignored the cries of the people for clean air, fresh water, and decent living conditions, then what else had it ignored? To revolutionaries, the city as stench was living proof that the ruling class had turned a blind eye to the suffering of the masses. The symbolism became powerful. Pamphlets and speeches described Paris as a diseased body that needed purging. Just as a doctor would drain a wound, so too must the revolution drain away corruption, greed, and neglect. The metaphor resonated deeply with ordinary Parisians, who literally lived among overflowing cesspits, polluted wells, and streets that reeked of horse manure and human waste. During the revolution, however, the stench of Paris did not magically disappear. In fact, in some ways, it grew worse. The collapse of old systems meant that regulations on waste disposal, weak as they had been, became even harder to enforce. Butchers continued to spill blood into the gutters. Tanners dumped their foul chemicals into the Seine, and cesspits brimmed over. Aditutis, the violence of the revolution itself, created new smells, the smell of blood, of bodies left in the streets, of fires set during riots. Paris became a city where the very air seemed heavy with death. Yet despite this, the people endured. there is a strange resilience in how Parisians adjusted to their city's conditions. They covered the worst odors with perfumes or burning herbs. They tried to mask the foulness with the sweet scent of tobacco smoke in cafes or the smell of fresh bread from bakeries. Smell became part of survival, a way of claiming small victories in a world that seemed otherwise overwhelmed by decay. Foreign visitors during this period often remarked with horror at the contrast they witnessed. On one hand, Paris was the birthplace of modern politics, philosophy, and culture. On the other, it was a city where the basic act of walking down the street meant stepping over garbage and inhaling the stench of filth. Some compared it to a grand theater, magnificent from the front, but filled with broken machinery and foul odors behind the curtain. This contradiction shaped how the world viewed Paris. Some admired its brilliance, while others recoiled at its dirtiness, but no one could ignore it. In a way, the very filth of Paris helped cement its reputation as the most intense and paradoxical city in Europe. It was a place of genius and garbage, of perfume and sewage, of dazzling salons and overflowing. It is important to remember that the horrifying smell of Paris in the 18th century was not just about physical discomfort. It had real consequences for health. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera thrived in the unsanitary environment. Though the germ theory of disease had not yet been developed, people knew instinctively that their environment was making them sick. The stench was not just unpleasant, it was deadly. Families lost children to illnesses that modern sanitation would easily prevent. Entire neighborhoods were struck down by epidemics, leaving behind grief and despair. The revolutionaries, for all their zeal to remake society, struggled to tackle this problem. They were consumed with political turmoil, executions, and wars with foreign powers. The stench of Paris remained, lurking as a constant reminder that no matter how much the political order changed, the people were still breathing the same foul air. For some writers and artists, this was an irresistible metaphor. They portrayed Paris as a city trying to cleanse itself, not only politically but physically. The imagery of filth and odor became a way of describing corruption, injustice, and the need for rebirth. To imagine Paris without its stench was to imagine a new society, purified and renewed. And yet, the transformation would not come quickly. The horrifying smell of 18th century Paris would linger long after the revolution. It was a problem too large to be solved by one generation, and it would take decades, even centuries, to finally address. But as the century closed, one thing was clear. The smell of Paris had become inseparable from its identity. It was the smell of poverty and neglect, but also of resilience and survival. It was the smell of decay, but also of change. The people of Paris lived in a world that assaulted their senses daily, and yet from that world emerged ideas that would reshape the modern age. To walk the streets of Paris in the late 1700s was to experience extremes. You might hear the ringing voices of revolutionaries calling for liberty, equality, and fraternity, only to turn the corner and gag at the stench of an open cesspit. You might attend a salon where the future of Europe was being debated, then step outside into streets where refuse piled higher than the cobblestones. This was Paris at its most paradoxical. The city of light, cloaked in darkness. The city of ideas, suffocated by its own odors. The horrifying smell of Paris was more than a nuisance. It was a symbol, a reality, and a metaphor all rolled into one. And for the people who lived there, it was a daily reminder of how fragile and filthy life could be, even in the world's most celebrated city. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, the horrifying smell of Paris still lingered, almost like a curse passed from one generation to the next. The revolution had toppled kings, altered laws, and filled the streets with slogans of liberty and equality. But the stench of filth remained as stubborn as ever. For Parisians, this was proof that political change alone was not enough to improve daily life. The city itself, with its narrow medieval streets and its primitive waste systems, seemed determined to cling to its foul character. The problem was deeply structural. Paris had grown chaotically over centuries, expanding outward without much planning. Its medieval layout, beautiful in its tangled charm, was disastrous for public health. Narrow streets blocked air circulation, while tall buildings funneled odors downward like chimneys. Cesspits dug beneath homes overflowed into the soil and seeped into water wells, spreading invisible but deadly contamination. Even as the revolution promised new beginnings, families still lived above pits of their own waste, breathing in the damp, pungent air that rose through their floorboards. Travelers who visited Paris in these years wrote vivid accounts. They often contrasted the grandeur of the city as intellectual and cultural life with the wretched conditions of its streets. A philosopher could inspire the world in a candlelit salon, yet just outside, dogs fought over piles of rotting food scraps. The contrast was shocking. Paris was both the center of enlightenment and the capital of filth. Some compared it to a body dressed in fine clothes, but suffering from a festering illness within. The French authorities, weakened by political upheaval, struggled to address the crisis. Waste collectors still trudged through the city with carts, but their work was inconsistent and often corrupt. Many citizens simply dumped refuse into the street at night, hoping the rain would wash it away. The Seine, once the lifeblood of Paris, became a dumping ground, its waters carrying away everything from human waste to animal carcasses. Yet the river was also a source of drinking water, which meant that the very solution people relied on was poisoning them. Illnesses continued to spread. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases struck with regularity, and Parisians accepted them almost as part of life's rhythm. Few truly understood the connection between waste and disease. Germ theory was still decades away, but they knew instinctively that the foul air and polluted water were dangerous. The smell itself was treated as the danger, for many believed in the miasma theory, that bad odors carried illness directly into the body. To breathe in Paris was, in their minds, to breathe in sickness. This belief shaped behavior. Some Parisians carried small containers of vinegar-soaked cloth, which they held to their noses to filter the air. Others burned incense or herbs in their homes, trying to mask the odors with sweeter scents. Wealthier citizens doused themselves in perfumes, creating a sharp contrast between the heavily perfumed and the deeply foul. Paris became a battlefield of smells, where survival meant finding ways to tolerate or disguise the unavoidable stench. Meanwhile, as Napoleon rose to power in the early 19th century, he too became aware of the problem. His ambitions to make Paris the capital of Europe clashed with the reality of its filth. He ordered some efforts to clean the streets and improve the city's infrastructure, but these measures were limited by the sheer scale of the issue. The city's population was growing rapidly, and with it, so too was the waste. Napoleon could win great battles, but even he struggled to conquer the stench of Paris. And yet, the smell was not simply an inconvenience. It was a daily reminder of inequality. The poorest neighborhoods, where families crowded into damp cellars or tiny apartments, were the worst hit. Their streets reeked the most. Their wells were most contaminated. Their children most vulnerable to disease. Wealthier citizens might escape to country estates or to neighborhoods where conditions were slightly better, but the poor had no such refuge. The smell of Paris, in many ways, was the smell of poverty. Writers of the era often used this reality as a metaphor. In plays, pamphlets, and novels, they described the city's stench as the lingering odor of corruption and neglect. It was said that even though the monarchy had fallen, the stink of injustice remained. The idea resonated deeply with the people. Paris was not just a physical city. It was a symbol of the nation, and its filth represented the unfinished work of reform. The persistence of the problem frustrated many. Revolutionaries had promised a new world, but daily life seemed to mock those promises. The horrifying smell was a constant reminder that while governments rose and fell, the people's struggle against filth continued. For ordinary Parisians, survival meant learning to live with it, to accept it as part of the backdrop of existence. They did not have the luxury of imagining a clean, modern Paris. They had only the reality of their time. Still, seeds of change were being planted. Doctors, engineers, and reformers began to study the city more carefully. Some argued that the only way forward was to redesign Paris itself, to widen its streets, improve its sewage, and modernize its water supply. Their voices were small at first, often ignored in the chaos of wars and revolutions, but they would grow louder as the 19th century advanced. For now, though Parisians remained trapped in their reality, a city of brilliance and filth, where the horrifying smell defined everyday life. By the early 1800s, the paradox of Paris had become famous across Europe. It was the city of light, of culture, of revolution, and also the city of stench, of waste, of sickness. To live there was to live in extremes, to breathe in both perfume and rot, to witness both beauty and decay. The horrifying smell had become part of the city's identity, inseparable from its history and its people. As the 19th century unfolded, the stench of Paris became not just a nuisance, but a question of survival for a rapidly growing city. By 1830, Paris had swelled to nearly 1 million inhabitants. The Revolution and Napoleon's empire had brought upheaval, but the underlying problem of waste management remained unresolved. Each passing decade made the crisis more pressing. With every new resident, every new household, every new animal in the market square, the volume of filth multiplied. The horrifying smell was no longer just a background feature of life, it was the defining challenge of urban existence. Travelers from abroad often remarked that Paris looked like a magnificent stage set, but behind the curtains, it reeked of decay. The French capital attracted artists, poets, and thinkers from across the continent, but it also shocked them with its odors. Visitors described nights when the stench from open sewers seemed to suffocate entire neighborhoods, especially during the humid summers. Letters from English tourists mocked the contrast. How could the city of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Hugo also be a city where refuse lay rotting in the streets? For many outsiders, the smell of Paris came to symbolize a hidden weakness in French society, a blemish on its reputation as the center of culture. Yet for Parisians themselves, the stench was so woven into daily life that it shaped their rhythms and behaviors. Housewives knew not to open windows during certain hours when the wind carried the worst odors from nearby cesspools. Merchants in marketplaces sprinkled herbs and lime on the ground, trying to mask the smells rising from beneath. Innkeepers and cafe owners sometimes burned scented wood or resin in the evenings to attract customers away from the stink outside. Entire neighborhoods developed reputations, not just for crime or poverty, but for their unbearable odors. To say that someone lived near such a street was almost an insult, as if the stench clung to them as well. The connection between smell and disease became increasingly urgent during outbreaks of cholera, which struck Paris repeatedly in the first half of the 19th century. In 1832, the first great cholera epidemic killed more than 18,000 Parisians within just a few months. Doctors, still clinging to the miasma theory, believed the terrible smell itself carried the poison of the disease. They urged citizens to protect themselves with perfumes, camphor, and vinegar-soaked cloths. Panic gripped the city, and people fled if they could, leaving behind the poor to suffer the most. The horrifying smell, once an inconvenience, now became associated directly with mass death. But cholera also awakened reformers. For the first time, the city's leaders could not ignore the link between public health and infrastructure. Reports were written, commissions assembled, engineers consulted. The consensus was clear. Paris could no longer survive on medieval cesspits and haphazard waste collection. If the city was to endure, it needed an entirely new system and underground network that could carry filth away from the streets, away from the people, and away from the water supply. Still, progress was slow. The political upheavals of the 1830s and 1840s distracted governments, and funding for large-scale projects was always uncertain. Parisians, meanwhile, lived in fear of both disease and the smell that seemed to herald it. The poor bore the heaviest burden. In working-class districts like the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, where families crowded into damp, airless rooms, the stench was unbearable. Children grew up breathing air heavy with rot, and their survival rates reflected the cruel environment. Richer Parisians might perfume their salons and flee to summer estates, but the poor had no escape. Writers captured this reality with increasing urgency. Victor Hugo, in his epic Les Miserables, would later describe the sewers of Paris not just as a physical space, but as a metaphor for the hidden corruption beneath society as surfed long before Hugo. However, pamphlets and plays had already made the stench of Paris into a symbol of social injustice. The smell was not just a physical condition to a moral one, proof that society was failing its most vulnerable citizens. Even the Seine itself seemed to protest. By mid-century, the river was so polluted that fish populations collapsed. Bargemen complained of nausea as they navigated its waters, while laundresses cursed the filth that stained the clothing they tried to wash. Yet astonishingly, Parisians continued to drink from the Seine, believing that boiling water was enough to make it safe. In truth, they were consuming diluted waste. The river that had once nourished the city had become a carrier of death, and its odor told the story plainly. The horrifying smell, then, was not just the result of poor waste management. It was the smell of a city caught between past and future. On the one hand, Paris was modernizing. Railways arrived, industry expanded, and intellectual life flourished. On the other hand, its infrastructure was still medieval, its streets still narrow and choked, its waste systems still primitive. The contradiction was unbearable, and reformers began to demand radical change. By the 1850s, the call for transformation grew louder. One man in particular would take up the challenge: Georges Eugene Haussmann. Appointed by Napoleon III as prefect of the Seine, Haussmann would later become famous for his sweeping reconstruction of Paris, tearing down entire neighborhoods to create wide boulevards, modern sewage systems, and improve sanitation. But before Haussmann's vision, Paris still lived in the shadow of its stench, still haunted by the horrors of the cholera years, still suffocating in the filth of its own making. The persistence of the smell gave rise to a kind of fatalism. Many Parisians believed their city was cursed, that no matter how much progress France made in science, politics, or art, the daily reality of filth would never leave them. Others clung to hope, believing that engineers and doctors might one day bring relief. For now, however, the horrifying smell remained the city's constant companion, a reminder of its failures, its inequalities, and its unfinished struggle for modernity. The mid-19th century would bring a turning point, but in the years leading up to it, the stench remained as powerful as ever, filling the lungs of every citizen, rich and poor alike. Paris might dazzle the world with its brilliance, but beneath the surface, the smell betrayed the truth, that the city of light was also, undeniably, a city of filth. By the mid-19th century, Paris stood at a crossroads. The horrifying smell that had haunted the city for centuries was no longer a mere inconvenience. It was a crisis that demanded resolution. For generations, Parisians had learned to live with it, to disguise it, to endure it, but now the age of resignation was ending. Science was advancing, medicine was evolving, and political leaders finally recognized that a modern capital could not coexist with medieval filth. The time had come for transformation. The man who embodied this transformation was Georges Eugene Haussmann, appointed prefect of the Seine in 1853 by Napoleon III. Haussmann was not merely an administrator, he was an architect of revolution, determined to rebuild Paris from its foundations. His vision was radical. Tear down the labyrinth of narrow, stinking medieval alleys, and replace them with wide, airy boulevards. Demolish the cesspits festering beneath homes, and replace them with a vast underground sewer network. Purify the city, or water supply, so that the Seine would no longer poison the very people who depended on it. For many Parisians, Haussmann's project seemed almost impossible. Entire neighborhoods were uprooted, families displaced, buildings demolished. The sound of hammers and pickaxes echoed across the city for years, as streets were widened, squares created, and monumental avenues carved into the dense urban fabric. But Haussmann was relentless, driven by the belief that Paris must be not only beautiful but livable. The smell that had defined the city for centuries was, in his mind, an enemy to be conquered. At the heart of this battle was the sewer system. Before Haussmann, Paris had only a fragmented network of drains, most of which carried filth directly into the Seine. Under his direction, engineers like Eugene Belgrand designed a modern system. Vast tunnels beneath the city that carried waste far away, out of sight and smell. These underground arteries transformed Paris from a city drowning in its own refuse into one capable of sustaining modern life. The sewers themselves became so iconic that by the late 19th century, they were even opened for public tours, proof that the city no longer feared its filth, but had mastered it. The impact was profound. Diseases that once swept through neighborhoods with terrifying regularity began to recede. The cholera epidemics that had devastated Paris in the 1830s and 1840s no longer found the same fertile ground. The air, once heavy with foul odors, grew cleaner. The Seine, though never pristine, was gradually relieved of its burden as sewage was diverted elsewhere. For the first time in centuries, Parisians could walk their streets without constantly battling the stench of decay. But Haussmann's transformation was not purely about health. It was also about identity. The new Paris that emerged in the second half of the 19th century was designed to impress the world. Wide boulevards lined with elegant buildings, grand squares, and clean, modern infrastructure turned Paris into a model for other cities. Visitors no longer left with memories of overpowering stench. Instead, they marveled at the grandeur of the boulevards, the sparkle of gas lamps, and the charm of cafes spilling onto clean pavements. The horrifying smell had been replaced by the fragrance of flowers in public gardens, and the aroma of freshly baked bread drifting from bakeries. Still, the memory of the old Paris lingered. Writers and historians reminded future generations of the price that had been paid for modernization. Victor Hugo, with his haunting descriptions of the city's sewers, ensured that the filth of old Paris was never entirely forgotten. The transformation became a symbol of human resilience, proof that even the dirtiest, most pestilent city could be reborn through determination, science, and vision. For ordinary Parisians, the change was life-altering. Families who once feared every summer heat wave, knowing it would amplify the city's stench, could finally breathe easier. Children who once grew up sickly in damp, foul-smelling rooms now had a chance at healthier lives. The poor still faced hardships, and inequality persisted, but the physical environment no longer condemned them to constant filth. The city itself had been reshaped to offer dignity along with survival. By the end of the 19th century, the horrifying smell that had defined Paris for generations was largely gone. In its place was a city that truly deserved its nickname, La Ville Lumi, the City of Light. Gas lamps illuminated wide boulevards where sewage no longer overflowed. Fountains sparkled with clean water, and the Seine reflected the glow of progress rather than the stench of waste. And yet, the story of Paris's smell is more than just a tale of infrastructure. It is a reminder of how deeply the conditions of daily life shaped the fate of entire societies. Political revolutions came and went. Kings were toppled and emperors rose. But none of it mattered to the ordinary Parisian if the streets still reeked of decay. It was only when the city confronted its filth that true progress became possible. The horrifying smell of 18th century Paris is gone, but its legacy endures. It teaches us that beauty and brilliance can never be separated from basic human needs, that a city cannot be great if it is not also clean, and that progress is measured not only in ideas and revolutions, but in the simple dignity of fresh air and clean water. So when we walk the boulevards of modern Paris, admiring the elegance of its avenues and the charm of its cafes, we should remember the centuries when the city stank so badly that people feared to breathe. We should remember the families who lived above set, the children who drank from poisoned wells, the travelers who gagged in its streets. And we should remember, too, the visionaries who refused to accept that reality, who dreamed of a different Paris, and who built it with stone, steel, and sweat. The story of the horrifying smell of Paris is, in the end, not just about filth, it is about transformation. From stench to fragrance, from decay to light, Paris remade itself, and in doing so, it offered the world a lesson. That even the darkest realities of human life can be overcome, and that sometimes the fight for beauty begins with the battle against a smell.